Welcome to this video on Can the Subaltern Speak by Gayatri Spivak. I'm Andrew Chapman. I'm a professor of philosophy, and I'll be your guide. Our purpose in this video is to provide you with a detailed yet accessible summary of this significant work, ensuring that you grasp its key concepts, understand its impact, and are prepared to discuss it critically in your classes and beyond. We'll begin by exploring the essay's central question and what Spivak means when she asks whether the subaltern can speak. Next, we'll examine who the subaltern are and why their situation is unique. We'll then investigate the problem of representation and Spivak's crucial distinction between different types of representation, followed by her concept of epistemic violence and how knowledge systems can oppress. We'll analyze her specific critique of Western intellectuals like Foucault and Deleuze and examine her case study of Bhubaneshwari Bhaduri. We'll also discuss what agency means within Spivak's framework, explore the essay's lasting impact on postcolonial studies, and address major criticisms of her work. Finally, we'll consider why this text remains urgently relevant today. Now let's get started with Can the Subaltern Speak? When Gayatri Spivak asks, Can the subaltern speak?, she's not asking whether marginalized people are physically capable of speech. Of course they are. The question is far more unsettling. Even when they speak, can they be heard? And even when their words are recorded, does their meaning survive the translation into dominant discourses? Spivak's answer is, in most cases, a devastating no. Published in 1988, this essay emerged from Spivak's engagement with postcolonial studies, deconstruction, Marxism, and feminism. As an Indian woman teaching in American academia, Spivak occupied a unique position to see how Western intellectuals, even well-meaning ones, tended to speak for the oppressed rather than creating conditions where they could speak for themselves. Spivak borrows the term subaltern from Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who used it to describe groups excluded from a society's established institutions and power structures. But Spivak gives it a more specific postcolonial inflection. The subaltern are those who are so thoroughly removed from the lines of social mobility that they have no access to institutional power or authorized channels of representation. They're not just the oppressed or the poor, they're those whose voices are structurally prevented from being heard in the dominant discourse. Think about the difference between a union organizer fighting for workers' rights and an undocumented migrant worker with no legal status, no education, no access to media or legal representation, and no recognized identity within the system. The union organizer can speak within established channels, even if they're fighting against the system. The undocumented worker is subaltern. Their speech can't register within institutional frameworks. Importantly, Spivak is especially concerned with subaltern women, who face a double displacement, excluded both as colonial subjects and as women within patriarchal structures. This intersectional analysis predates the term intersectionality by a few years and shows how different forms of oppression compound each other. Here's where Spivak's argument gets philosophically dense, but crucial. She distinguishes between two senses of representation that get confused in English but are separate in German. Vertretung, or political representation, speaking for somebody, and Darstellung, aesthetic representation, representing or depicting someone. Western intellectuals often conflate these. They think that by depicting the subaltern, by including them in their research, their theories, their books, they're also representing them politically, speaking for their interests. But Spivak argues that this is exactly wrong. When Western academics presume to speak for the subaltern, they're actually substituting their own sophisticated theoretical language for the subaltern's voice. The subaltern becomes a character in the intellectual's narrative, rather than a speaker in their own right. Consider how this plays out. A French philosopher writes about the oppressed. An American academic reads a translation of that philosopher and writes about what the oppressed really need. A policymaker reads that academic and implements programs based on these theories. At no point were the actual oppressed people consulted as agents with their own analysis. Their speech has been entirely ventriloquized by others. One of Spivak's most influential concepts is epistemic violence, the violence done to people through knowledge systems. This isn't physical violence, it's the violence of having your own frameworks of meaning erased and overwritten by dominant systems of knowledge. Colonialism didn't just exploit people economically and dominate them politically. It also invalidated their ways of knowing, their languages, their conceptual frameworks. Indigenous knowledge systems were dismissed as primitive or superstitious. Western epistemology, that is, Western ways of organizing, categorizing, and producing knowledge, was imposed as universal truth. This violence continues even after formal colonization ends. When we study formerly colonized peoples using Western theoretical frameworks, when we require them to articulate their experiences in Western languages and concepts, when we assume Western categories are neutral and universal, we're continuing epistemic violence. Here's a concrete example. When British colonizers encountered the practice of sati, that is, widow self-immolation, in India, they described it as barbaric and eventually outlawed it. The rhetoric was white men saving brown women from brown men. But Spivak asks, was anyone listening to the women themselves? The Colonial Archive contains extensive British debates about sati and some texts by Indian men defending or opposing it. But the voices of the women who were actually involved are almost entirely absent. They couldn't speak in a way that would be heard because the entire discourse was framed by others. Spivak has particular criticism for Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, two French theorists who were celebrated for their radical politics and their critiques of power. In a conversation published in 1972, Foucault and Deleuze claimed that they were done speaking for others. They would just let the oppressed speak for themselves. Sounds good, right? But Spivak points out the massive blind spot here. Foucault and Deleuze spoke as if the oppressed had unproblematic access to self-representation, as if all that was needed was for intellectuals to step aside. But this assumes that oppressed people already speak the language of power, already have access to channels of communication, already exist within structures where their speech can register as meaningful. This is profoundly naive about how power works, Spivak argues. The subaltern can't simply speak for themselves because the entire structure of discourse excludes them. By claiming to step aside, Foucault and Deleuze actually obscure the complex mediations required for subaltern speech to become audible. They present a fantasy of unmediated voice that's available only to those who already have institutional power. Moreover, by claiming they're not speaking for others while continuing to theorize within Western academia, publishing in prestigious venues, and building their reputations, Foucault and Deleuze benefit from a kind of gesture that costs them nothing while seeming politically correct. Spivak illustrates her argument with a haunting historical example. Bhubaneshwari Bhaduri was a young Bengali woman who hanged herself in 1926. Years later, it was discovered that she'd been involved in an anti-colonial militant group and had been assigned to carry out a political assassination. Unable to complete the task, she killed herself instead. Now here's the crucial detail. Bhubaneshwari waited until she was menstruating to commit suicide. In Bengali culture, women who commit sati do so not during menstruation to prove that their act is voluntary and not coerced by pregnancy or sexual impropriety. Bhubaneshwari's suicide during menstruation was an attempt to encode a message. This is a political act, not a personal one about sexual shame. But her message wasn't received. Her family interpreted her suicide as the result of an illicit love affair. The political meaning she tried to inscribe in her act was simply illegible to those around her. Even her careful attempt to speak through the language of her body was misread. This is what it means for the subaltern to not be able to speak. Bhubaneshwari spoke, through her actions, through her timing, but she couldn't make herself heard. The codes she used couldn't be decoded in the available frameworks. Now, Spivak's argument is often misread as totally pessimistic, as if she's saying the subaltern have no agency whatsoever. That's not quite right. She's saying that within the dominant discourses, the subaltern cannot speak as subaltern. Their speech either gets translated into hegemonic terms and thus ceases to be subaltern, or doesn't register as speech at all. But this doesn't mean they're passive victims. Subaltern people resist, organize, and create meaning in their own communities all the time. The point is that these acts don't automatically translate into being heard within the dominant institutions and discourses. There's a gap, often an unbridgeable gap, between subaltern speech and institutional audibility. Spivak's call, then, is for intellectuals to be far more humble and self-aware. We need to recognize the violence we might commit even in well-intentioned attempts to give voice to the oppressed. We need to create institutional conditions where subaltern voices might emerge, rather than presuming to speak for them. We need to learn to unlearn our privilege, to recognize how our own positions of relative power shape what we can even perceive as meaningful speech. Can the Subaltern Speak has become one of the most cited works in postcolonial studies. It fundamentally challenged how academics approach questions of representation and advocacy. It introduced concepts like epistemic violence that have become standard analytical tools. And it forced a generation of scholars to confront their own complicity in structures of domination. The essay influenced the development of subaltern studies as a discipline, even as Spivak herself was critical of some developments in that field. It shaped postcolonial feminism's attention to the specific situations of women in the global South. It informed critical development studies' critique of development discourse and its impact on local communities. You can see Spivak's influence in contemporary debates about representation in media, who gets to tell whose stories, in discussions about decolonizing the curriculum, in arguments about the limits of liberal multiculturalism, and in critiques of poverty porn and savior narratives in humanitarian work. The essay is famously difficult. Spivak's prose is dense, elusive, and assumes familiarity with multiple theoretical traditions. Critics have argued that, ironically, an essay about how the subaltern can't speak is written in language that's inaccessible to most people, including most subaltern subjects. The essay might be about the subaltern, but it's definitely written for Western academics. Some critics argue that Spivak's answer, that the subaltern cannot speak, is too pessimistic and potentially disempowering. If we take her argument to its extreme, it might suggest there's no point in efforts to amplify marginalized voices, since translation is always impossible. Scholars like Benita Perry have argued that Spivak underestimates the agency and resistance of colonized peoples by focusing so heavily on the structures that silence them. Others point out that there's something paradoxical about Spivak's own position. She's a highly successful academic speaking within elite Western institutions about how the subaltern can't speak within elite Western institutions. Hasn't she herself found a way to make certain kinds of subaltern knowledge audible? Or has she done so only by ceasing to be subaltern herself, by learning to speak in the master's language? Spivak has responded to these criticisms over the years, clarifying and developing her argument. She's emphasized that she's not saying subaltern people are speechless, but that their speech often can't be heard as speech within dominant frameworks. She's also increasingly focused on the importance of teaching and creating pedagogical spaces where different kinds of knowing might be recognized. In our current moment, Spivak's questions are more urgent than ever. When social media seems to give everyone a voice, when representation matters has become a mantra, when elite institutions tout their diversity initiatives, Spivak asks us to slow down and to think harder. Does visibility equal power? Does inclusion in dominant narratives equal liberation? Can speaking within institutional channels transform those institutions, or does it always require translating your demands into terms those institutions already recognize? Think about contemporary examples. When undocumented immigrants share their stories in mainstream media, but only the good immigrants with sympathetic narratives get airtime. When Black Lives Matter activists have to package their demands in ways that make white liberals comfortable. When indigenous protests against pipelines are covered by media that can't understand their spiritual relationship to the land. when survivors of sexual violence have to tell their stories in a way that satisfy legal definitions of assault. These are all cases where speech happens, but raises the question, who's really speaking, and who's being heard? Whose framework structures what counts as a legitimate claim? Spivak forces us to confront these uncomfortable questions. The essay reminds us that good intentions aren't enough, that representation is always a fraught political question, that we need to remain critically vigilant about whose voices are amplified and how they're translated. For anyone engaged in advocacy, activism, or scholarship dealing with marginalized communities, Can the Subaltern Speak is essential reading. Difficult, troubling, but ultimately necessary.